Dun, dun, dun. Oh, wow, that's loud. Okay. Okay, let's get started here. I guess we see if anyone has any questions. Hopefully the midterm was okay. Cautious head nodding. Okay, we'll see. I've only just started marking it, so it is probably going to be a little bit yet. But I will keep you up to date as we go. I'm trying a new thing where I mark a little bit of one class and then a little bit of another class. So I'm trying to be maximally inefficient in both classes, if at all possible. All right, so today, all right. Why so many chairs? Why always so many chairs? All right, curling with chairs. Ugh. Oh, it's curling too much. There we go. Okay, that works. Since no one's sitting there, otherwise that could have been tragic. All right, so today what we're going to do, and I think we'll likely get through the entirety of this today, is we're going to talk about sort of our last bit of sort of theory and kind of historical arguments when it comes to sociology of religion. Because what we're going to get into for the rest of the course after that is things that are much more contemporary. Now, if I had my own way about things, and I guess I could have just pushed the midterm back later, I suppose. But you know, we don't want to push things too late either. I would probably include the Churching of America with that last midterm, because then you'd have all the theory done, and then we'd be into more contemporary stuff to end off the course. But as it turns out, you know, I didn't do that, and I never have been able to quite fit that into my there should be about a month between midterms sort of mentality. So here it is, you know, after the second midterm, and it is our last little bit of theory before we move in. My answers for midterm questions 3 and 4 almost because I had a brain fart. Am I screwed? I don't know. That really depends on what the two questions are. You know, I don't know. I look forward to finding out. Oh, good. Erica's here. My chronometer. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know. Okay. So, this is, and here, you will all mourn with me, I suppose. This is our sort of our last big moment of the course, like where we're going to talk about Rodney Stark. Yeah, so we are after this point essentially done with my good buddy, and I'm sure yours. You know, a person who you will wake up in the middle of the night, you know, having nightmares about writing essay questions about him for the rest of your life, probably. Our good friend Rodney Stark. Okay, so this is kind of one of Stark's later books, you know, and this was updated because I think this is like the second edition of this book. The first edition I think ended in 1995, and then he and Roger Fink updated it to 2005. You know, writing the book in I think 2006, 2007. Okay, so what's really interesting about this book, right, is it takes a lot of the arguments of, say, things like market theory, and it moves them forward a little bit, you know, out of sort of that medieval, you know, the ancient, you know, the antiquity kind of context that we've been talking about in the rise of Christianity, some of the kind of medieval context that he talks about in Secularization, Rip, and the Triumph of Faith, and then applies those same ideas to the United States. Try and get a sense of how well those theories sort of stand up, right? Okay, so I will say this is another bit of what Stark is known for in a lot of ways in the sort of revisionist history, right? Where Stark, and with Roger Fink here, will essentially take aim at a lot of the sort of historically sort of agreed upon understandings of religion in America, and basically kind of put those through a blender and say, a lot of those assumptions are essentially false. So like, he does in Secularization, RIP, with the myth of past piety, he's going to do the same sort of thing for the United States, right? So he, argued that, in the past, Europe was never that religious, even though we tend to think of Europe as super religious. He's going to make essentially sort of a similar argument with the United States. And yeah, he's basically seeking, as Stark always does, right? And again, his obituary from Washington University, right? He called him a reckless eclectic, and this is the reckless eclectic at his finest. Right? He's going to seek and try to change the way we understand religion in America, right? And to do this, right? And this is what I think Stark is particularly brilliant at. He goes and tries to reconstruct church membership historically in the United States prior to modern surveys and censuses, right? Which only start in about 1860, right? He does this using a bunch of, qualitative and quantitative methods, mostly qualitative, and mostly, again, kind of assembling anecdotal historical sources. Okay. So, I think we've all sort of existed enough in the American orbit, right? That we're sort of familiar with the founding mythologies of the United States, right? And, especially, right, what do you see here in this sort of, painting is, the first Thanksgiving, right? Or basically the Pilgrims who had come over from, after being kind of religiously repressed in England, come across, on the Mayflower, landed at Plymouth Rock and quickly found themselves starving to death. And then, essentially made pacts with the indigenous people and proceeded to thrive in the New World. But one of the things that's generally sort of suggested is that, from the very beginning, America was extremely religious, right? And especially with our pilgrims, right? The image of the pilgrims as these hyper-religious people, and they come over, in the early 17th century, and they're some of the first colonists in North America. And they, the idea has been that kind of religiosity that the Pilgrims brought over from England stayed with them and, basically carried all the way through American history. So America has always been this hyper-religious place, right? But Stark and Fink basically say that's not so, right? The idea that America has been a fundamentally religious place since its inception is basically incorrect, right? It's a sort of historical looking backwards, and in a lot of ways, reading the religiosity that comes out of, say, the great revivals that pour over from England, more on those in a sec, and then the really high sort of watermark of religion in the United States, which actually probably hits more around the 1950s than 1776, as the norm, right? That was how everything had been before then. And then, the decline in religion that comes with the 60s, 70s, and forward, that's the historical aberration. Okay, so what do Stark and Fink actually suggest? Well, that early in American life, And so, right, in 1776, the year of the American Revolution, only about 17%, right? So less than a fifth of Americans were what they call churched, right? Meaning that they were part of a religious, a particular church congregation, right? So a relatively small number. Okay. Oh, right, that's Democracy in America, this book by de Tocqueville. All right, so past accounts of American religiosity, right? And things that, again, sort of play into this idea of America as hyper-religious. Okay, so visiting America in the 19th century, right? Alexis de Tocqueville, who's a French citizen, right? He comes over from France, right, to basically kind of examine the state of democracy in America. Because democracy at that point, right, is a relatively new, political system, and he wants to get a sense of what is going on, right? Okay, so in his now famous Democracy in America, right, he writes things like, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck his attention, right? So by, the 19th century, when he's coming over, so we're in the 1800s now, right? He's struck by how religious America is. Now, note, if you want to link this back to Stark's case in Secularization, RIP, right, and that myth of past piety, de Tocqueville is coming over from France, right? So in coming over from France, he's clearly thinking that France is, way less religious than America. So already we can get a sense that by the 19th century, right, France, and French citizens find American religion a little bit off-putting. Other European scholars who came over to America, right, people like Francis Grund from Austria, Andrew Reed from England, Philip Schaff from Germany, and probably most notably, Max Weber, also from Germany, right? And because, you're in a sociology class, you've been tormented with Weber from your very early days, right? That he's a pretty foundational sort of sociologist. Okay, so they all kind of, oops, I'm gonna undo what I just did. They all found American religion to be quite different from European religion, right? And what are the reasons, right? Okay, so what they were all accustomed to when it came to religion in Europe, right? It was churches receiving support from the state, right? And again, if you remember our religious kind of market idea, right, that would be a sort of monopoly situation where the state has picked a religious group and it's going to, sort of lavish resources onto that particular religious group, right? So in England, it would have been the Church of England, right? The Anglicans. In France, largely would have been the Catholic Church. In Germany, it would have been sort of split between the Catholics and the evangelicals, but by evangelicals here we mean Lutherans, right? So they were accustomed to this, and they were deeply surprised that in America, because America, right, from the very early days, had eschewed a state religion, right, and basically banned the federal government from establishing any particular religion as the state religion, and they were surprised that churches could maintain membership when people had to actively support churches out of their own pocket, right? So in America, if a church is going to run, people are reaching into their pockets to, give of their own income, right? And here's from Weber, right? So he explains, church affiliation in the USA brings with it incomparably higher financial burdens, especially for the poor, than anywhere in Germany. Okay, again, the difference between the systems of religion in the two countries are notable here, right? Okay, and he gives the example of a congregation on Lake Erie where German lumberjacks, right, paid approximately 80 out of their $1,000 yearly salary to support the church, right? So, that's almost 10% of their annual salaries going to the church. And he noted, everyone knows that even a small fraction of this financial burden in Germany would lead to a mass exodus from the church, right? So very different accounts. American religion looks very different, even in the early days, going back to, right, that separation of church and state that happens in American religion. Okay, so what is the nostalgia, right? What does the myth of past piety get wrong about American religion, right? Okay, so we have this image of the Pilgrims, right, as hyper-religious. Oops, that's a highlighter. That's going to go wrong. Right, we see them as hyper-religious, right? And we link this image to America as a whole through its whole history. But Stark and Fink say this causes some fundamental problems in our understanding. And what it ignores is what the United States was in the early days, right? And what they suggest is that, the colonies, right, those 13 initial colonies, and then as America expands, westward, they're basically expanding into open frontiers, right? And open frontiers have, lots of charm, and obviously we romanticize things like the Wild West, for particular reasons, right? It speaks to, this human inclination towards freedom and discovery and adventure and all of those things. But these open frontiers were also oriented largely towards commercial profit, right? There's a lot of work towards exploitation of these lands and resources, conquest of them, and the people who tend to be attracted to this, right, are often, recent male immigrants lacking social ties, right? Okay, so here what they suggest, right, is that like a good many other frontiers in history, right, where you have, things like, transient populations, relatively weak social institutions, right, because there's a lag. As you move out into a frontier, there's a lag before social institutions really get a foothold and get strongly established, right? So there's a big lag. So what we have is weak institutions, relatively weak ties, right? Lots of transient people. And so what was the early American frontier like? And the American frontier, as it moved west all through, kind of the 18th and 19th centuries, well, what we see is high levels of social deviance, right? Crime, prostitution, and alcohol abuse. I don't know, you probably, because you're all, I think, too young to have ever really probably, been introduced to the culture of Westerns, right? But if you ever go watch an old Western movie, right? And, again, I owe this to my dad because my dad loves Western movies. So as a kid, we watched lots of Westerns, right? Lots of John Wayne movies and all of that stuff. The frontier that's depicted is one that is pretty rough, right? There's there's always a tavern. There's always prostitutes, right? There's always, crime and deviance and cattle rustlers and outlaws, right? Train robbers, bank robbers, and the like, right? This is what frontiers are like because the institutions are relatively weak, right? What you'll see in those kinds of depictions of the West is things like law enforcement was far away, right? You had maybe a sheriff, but you had like the U.S. Marshals, and they would have been days away if you needed help from the U.S. Marshal Service, right? So lots of, untethered young men looking for profit and, doing what young men who are untethered from social bonds tend to do, which is, gamble, drink, frequent prostitutes, and commit crimes, right? And what goes along with that is relatively low levels of church involvement, right? So America, through much of its frontier days, had pretty low levels of church involvement. Okay, now even our Puritans, right? So the Puritans that settled in, in Massachusetts. I keep wanting to say Pride Rock, but that's the Lion King. What is it? Plymouth Rock. It's Plymouth Rock. Pride Rock sounds better. Plymouth Rock. Right, so even the Puritans, who had come over, facing religious persecution, they settle, in kind of on the eastern seaboard of the United States, and they initially do have high levels of religious involvement, right? So they land in about 1620. By the time we hit the mid-1600s, right, mid to late 1600s, So the period 1650 to about 1690. What happens is we start to see increasing signs of religious apathy and dissent. So the first generation that comes over is very religious. Then they have children and grandchildren, and those subsequent generations become more like the people of the frontier, right? And their religiosity sort of tanks. Yeah, the second generation and then subsequent immigrants to New England were far less enthusiastic than those initial migrants, right? I feel like this one card is following me around. I feel like that's the same student that's lost his one card in the other room I teach in. Okay, no worries. Right, so what happens is, right, you get that initial wave of the pilgrims, but the immigrants that follow, right, are these relatively weakly religious, like weakly with an A, right, not two E's, weakly religious Europeans, right, coming from places like England, like Germany, like France, like, Ireland to an extent. And so what you have in these newer migrants is less religiosity than those early kind of settlers. Okay. Do people hate Weber? Not nearly enough. Sorry, not a big Weber fan. It goes back to I'm not a fan of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. American institutions were robbing the poor like that far back. I mean, kind of. But I mean, there weren't really that strong of American institutions going back into, the 1600s, certainly. And then even as the society or the civilization or the country moved west, right, it takes time, right? So there's really weak institutions. There might not even be a bank in most places, right? So, people are, oh, I'm going to get to that. We're not ready to talk about slavery just yet, but we will. We're going to talk about African Americans and the Black church at some point. But I've lost my mouse. There it is. Okay. Okay. Did slavery? Okay, we're trying to talk about slavery. Why was the second generation less religious? Does it have to do with declining stocks of knowledge? So it's probably not declining stocks of knowledge, right? Because they would have been raised sort of relatively religiously. I think what happens is the sort of impetus that had driven their parents to be as religious as they were, which was largely, religious persecution, by the English government, that disappears, right? So a lot of that bonding glue, or you might call it like a rally around the flag effect, sort of dissolves, right? And suddenly people are just like less religious, right? Because whatever was pushing people towards that cohesive religious identity kind of falls apart. What you then get to is, you're on the frontier and you're pushing outward, and those institutions, right, churches, largely that would have helped people kind of in community life and held you in social bonds, they lag behind, people's expansion westward, right? So, once you move away from, say, Plymouth, into, like Ohio, if that's where you want to go, ultimately those institutions take a little bit of time. And when you're disconnected from those institutions, you sort of lose a lot of, you sort of lose some of that religiosity because there's no surrounding social infrastructure to support it. Could the decline have been influenced by legitimized violence by the slave codes? I would say probably not, right? If you're thinking of like people being morally scandalized by slavery, and so, sort of dropping religion based on that, people really, if you look at the accounts of the time, most people didn't think of slavery as anything particularly problematic. There are certainly voices that did, right? And especially once you get into the 19th century, you get really powerful voices especially starting in the UK, or England, right, with people like William Wilberforce, who come to be very anti-slavery, and you have some in the US as well. But for most people, it was just sort of a social norm that very few people questioned, right? So yeah, it's not, that's an interesting postulation, but I don't think there'd be much evidence to kind of back it up. Okay. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and social views definitely varied, right? But yeah, I mean, largely you only get a sort of big rejection of slavery in the 19th century, right? And the Enlightenment plays a role in this, but so do the great revivals, right? The great revivals that really drive religiosity empower a group called evangelicals, right? And again, it starts in England. And England, not surprisingly, is the first one to ban slavery, and then that ban sort of spreads out over the, through the Western world after that. And it's, a mix of kind of Enlightenment, kind of rationality, and sort of evangelical Christian zeal that actually, ends up bringing slavery to an end, at least on the legal side. Okay, those are great questions. All right, so from the book. This is our church membership chart that Stark and Fink reconstruct in the book, right? So what do we see? Church membership in 1776, relatively low, right? At 17%. Once we get into, it gets easier to reconstruct data once we get into the 1860s, right? Because we start to get the census and they start to ask religious questions. That said, even in 1860, right, which still less than a century after the American founding, and now with better kind of statistical tools, we're still only talking a little bit more than a third of Americans who belong to a specific church body, right? Okay, goes down a little bit in 1870, right? That's the only time it goes down with the data that Stark and Fink collect, right? It drops down to 35%, which they largely attribute to sort of the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War and a lot of social dislocation that happens with the end of the Civil War, right? You get shifts of population, people move around all over the place, and things really do kind of get a little bit messy. But by the turn of the 20th century, right, we're up in majority territory of Americans who belong to a church congregation. And actually, the highest point that Stark and Fink measure actually is in the year 2000, right? Where essentially 2/3 of Americans say that they belong to some kind of church body, right? So that they are churched. So again, what's the story here in a sense if we think about, some of the theories that we've talked about, right? So if we think about our inherited model, right, of secularization, right, what's the formula there? Modernity is toxic, right, to religion. And from this kind of data, if Stark and Fink are correct, we would have to absolutely 100% reject that thesis. Why? Well, here, it's basically, industrialization starts in England in about, somewhere around 1750 and spreads to the United States thereafter. Let's say like a 30-year lag. So by 1780, we're starting to get major industrialization in the United States. As the United States actually goes through modernity, right? It starts to modernize. It's actually getting more religious, right? And this is probably largely due to its institutions sort of settling in, a lot of those frontiers actually becoming sort of stable, settled places, and the whole thing kind of calming down a little bit. But certainly, this sort of graph doesn't look like modernity is toxic to religion. Far from it, right? There's obviously something else going on. Or you can even make the opposite case, that modernity, at least in the case of the United States, actually helped religion thrive. So there you go. Okay, so yeah, following our colonial period, right, adherence rates begin a long and steady ascent, double from 1776 to 1860, declines a bit following the Civil War, and then rises steadily from 1870 to 1926. Again, right, so 1926, we're here, and then kind of rises really slowly after that, right? Rises just slightly after the Second World War, and continues to rise until the 2000s. And we'll talk about the religious landscape in our next unit, because the 1990s and the 2000s are an interesting moment, and things really do change at that point. But that is a story for another day. Okay. So, Stark and Fink, right? They argue using this data. Again, this old, and I already said this, so I won't belabor it, this old thesis that modernity and religion are incompatible makes no sense. Religion in America seems to have gotten stronger through a good part of its modernization. So there has to be a different story. Okay, so, you know what? When you Google like big crosses and American flags, you come up with some truly striking images, which I have just like plopped all over this slideshow. And I honestly have to say, like visually, just because of pictures like this is one of my favorite like units in the course, just from a visual perspective. Because I don't know, it's like super, it just looks pretty sometimes. Like this is like a really nice picture. The sky, the flag, the cross, all that jazz. Okay, it's pretty. So, what makes American religion different, right? So what does de Tocqueville say? All agree. The main reason for the quiet... our highlighter here. We need highlighter. Oh, that's red. That's bad. No. Okay, yellow. The quiet sway of religion over their country was the complete separation of church and state, right? So that's de Tocqueville in 1835. Philip Schaff, right? 1855. The United States are by far the most religious and Christian country in the world because religion is the most free, right? Okay, je ne voulais pas faire ça. Okay, right, so we see there the outlines of the kind of market theory that Stark has been an advocate of for a long time. Right, okay, so this is our First Amendment. I almost said it was the Second Amendment. It's the First Amendment. Right, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, right? So this is baked deep into the U.S. Constitution, right? It is the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, so super important. And what do Stark and Fink argue? Well, it's that deregulated nature that has allowed it to succeed, especially compared to Europe, right? Europe has never had this level of deregulation in religion. To this day, if you try to open a new church, say in Germany, there are barriers to it because the two recognized churches are the Catholic and Lutheran churches. Okay. Would I say Trump is backing Christianity or just openly very religious? I think Trump is an absolute narcissistic, megalomaniacal cynic who will say or do anything to get power, and he's found a ready base of people in the Christian right that for some reason like him. I can't fathom why. He is, I think he's the furthest, is Trump Gog or the Antichrist? I don't know. That's an interesting question. I'm not really up on my eschatological readings of Donald Trump. Is he the beast of Revelations? Or Revelation, rather? I don't know. I would rather not speculate on it. He's just a very bad orange man. The shawl. I do not know what that is. I will have to look that up later, which I shall. Okay, but yeah, no, I think honestly, like the man who ran a beauty contest said he would grab women by the, and has slept with a porn star after his wife had given birth. I wouldn't class him as very religious. Plus, when he actually does show up to religious services, the guy just looks like he has absolutely no idea what's going on. I remember one time, during the first election run, he showed up to, I want to say it was a Methodist church, or maybe it's Presbyterian, I can't remember. And the Presbyterians use what's called the Revised Common Lectionary, and it's just a set of readings, right, that are set, and that every church that uses it follows it for this particular Sunday in the month. And it was something like, the powerful shall be made lowly, and Trump found that to be quite offensive because he's like, I felt like that reading was targeted at me, suggesting that I think while he calls himself a Presbyterian, he hasn't gone often enough to realize that the pastor wasn't choosing the reading. But less on Trump. But no, I don't think he's openly religious. I think he's found a ready base that is willing to support him, and he's going to ride that pony till he dies, which hopefully is soon. I think. I don't like Trump. I'm sorry. If you're MAGA, I'm sorry. I just can't bring myself to liking Donald Trump. All that stuff. Plus, now gas is super expensive, and it's really expensive to fill up a minivan, and I'm sort of mad about that. I guess I could have had less children, but I'd have to go back in time for that. And the minivan doesn't have a flux capacitor, so there you go. A little Back to the Future joke for you. All right. Plus not made of stainless steel. I guess I'd have to get a Cybertruck, but they're ugly and I don't want one. Okay, so by the middle of by the middle of the 18th century, right? What's going on in the United States, right? So we're talking about the 1700s, right? So by the middle of the 1700s, what is going on in the U.S.? Well, we have, a lot of settlers. There's a diversity of settlers and, their religions. And religious apathy and space basically leads to an erosion in support for established churches, right? So again, as they move out into the frontier, as they're in the kind of wilds, right? There's a lot of space from them. There's a lot of religious apathy. And it basically, there's an erosion in the established churches, right? And basically what Stark will make the argument for here is that there were a set of churches that, say, came over from the old world, from Europe, and that set up shop in the United States. They were pretty strongly established, but mostly kind of on the East Coast, right? They would have been in the sort of centers, right? They would have been in your New Yorks, they would have been in your Chicagos, they would have been in your Bostons. But their power and their influence kind of didn't extend far into the frontier. So in the frontier, you have religious apathy and, kind of churchlessness going on generally. Okay, so without explicit regulation or the establishment of a national faith, churches didn't really cater to the state, right? So what ends up happening, right, is the state doesn't support them, right? The state sort of doesn't play any role in the religious life of most places. So what happens, right, as you move into the frontier, right? There's no established churches, right? The government's not stopping anyone from forming a church. So what you get is what Stark and Fink call the upstarts, right? Or upstart faiths, and their preachers, right? They basically, what you get, sorry, I guess I'm stumbling over myself here. What you get is religious innovation, right? There are people who look at it and they're like, wow, people in this country aren't particularly religious, right? Religion has failed these people, and you get a bunch of religious innovators, right? They start to innovate in all sorts of ways. Okay, so traditional secularization model, right, says that to the extent that religious groups survive, they eventually give less and less attention to the supernatural. But what Stark and Fink suggest is that quite the opposite is true. History actually contradicts this quite strongly. It's actually the less secularized faiths, right, the more supernatural ones, that have the steepest growth curves historically, right? And again, this is a sort of, answer to a question that Stark's asked many times is, what do people want from religion? which he answers, right, well, what they want is, he says, religion. What he means by this is actually the supernatural, right? Or what Smith might call superhuman powers, right? They want some connection to those things, right? Very few people show up to church or the mosque or the synagogue or the temple, right, in order to just have a fun social program or a time of gathering. You can get those things anywhere, right? And frankly, if we're talking about the Old West, the church is going to be way more of a downer than the saloon, right? At the saloon, there's whiskey, there's gambling, there's prostitutes, right? So much more fun than what's at church, ostensibly. Okay, so what he says is that the decline of what's called the main line, right? And here, I apologize, we're introducing a new term a little bit early. We talk about mainline denominations. What we're talking about is basically old and established Protestant churches. Right? So again, here think of things like the Lutherans, right, who would have started in Germany in the 16th century, the Anglicans, right, which would have started in England in the 16th century, Presbyterians, those are Scottish, right, and these older, more established forms of religion, right? And one of the big stories, and when we get to the religious landscape, I will talk about this again. One of the big stories of religious life in America, and this is actually true in Canada as well, is that, really since the middle part of the 20th century, the main line has declined really, really sharply, right? And I mean, again, we'll see it when we see the charts in the next unit, but it is incredible how quickly the main line has collapsed, right? Now, what Stark says is we tend to think of the collapse of the main line as a relatively recent phenomenon. But he says that actually the collapse of mainline colonial churches was marked from 1776 to 1850. And here, what he's essentially going to make the argument for is that sort of establishment and decline of religious groups is a sort of cyclical thing, right? It kind of goes, wavy, 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 where you have, religious upstarts, they become really successful, they get established, but then they lose some of their supernatural or otherworldly characteristics, and then religion starts to decline, until you hit a point where, religious people think there's a crisis, and then you get new innovators that come in, and then they create new churches, right? And that drives revival until those people get established, and then, people get bored of them too, and they lose their, they want to get respectable, and, they want to get invited to cocktail parties and be treated as proper intellectuals. So they get established too, and they set up seminaries, and people lose interest. And then you get, these waves over and over, right? So what I'm describing here is the self-limiting model of secularization, right, which is the argument that they're making in this book. Okay, so what are they going to say, right? In 1776, Congregationalists, the people who founded Harvard, by the way, Presbyterians, Princeton, and Episcopalians went from 55%, or over half of all church adherents, to 19% in 1850, right? Now today, they make up only about 4% of church adherents in the United States. So you have your upstart faiths, right? Now these are principally churches that today we would think of as established, right? And if you look here, right, the decline of the mainline churches is a more contemporary one. You have the United Methodist Church here, but back in the 1800s, right, they're an upstart, right? The Baptists on here? Oh, yeah, the Southern Baptist. If it was the Southern Baptist, this number would be a lot bigger, right? American Baptists, though, again, they were upstarts. Today, they're a very established and respectable sort of religious group. Okay, so the Methodists, the Baptists, basically, they grow explosively. And what Stark and Fink suggest is that this comes largely from their ability to adapt themselves to that expanding American frontier and set up organizations that meet people's needs, right? But not just there, right? They also outcompeted older churches in New England, right? By 1850, there are more Methodists and Baptists in New England than Congregationalists, right? So again, Congregationalists being an older form. And they're so gone now that you don't even see them on here, right? Okay. Here I'm blending in some modern stuff from my buddy, and you're going to meet him some more in the next unit when we talk about the religious landscape, because I relentlessly use his charts. This is from my buddy, who I don't know. But like Rodney Stark, I like him a lot. Though he's not as provocative as Stark. He's a much nicer person. We all have our flaws. His name is Ryan Burge. He's a professor at Eastern Illinois University, right? You can find, if you want, you can find his Substack at Graphs About Religion. Just search Graphs About Religion. Great Substack if you're interested in SOCs of religion, right? Okay, so what does this show, right? Projected versus actual size of denominations of different kind of mainline Protestant churches. And what we see, right, is that they've basically all declined. Basically, if they had just kept up with population growth, that should be the blue, right, in terms of numbers. And the orange is their actual size, right? So they've all kind of gone into major decline, with the exception of the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, which is a conservative split-off of the Presbyterian Church of America. Yeah, you can tell I spend way too much time reading, a bunch of random stuff about religion in America that I know the difference between PCA and PCUSA. But there you go, right? And here, right, are Methodists, had they just kept up from 1990 to 2021 with population growth, they would be about 20% of the population. They're 13.7, and should actually be smaller now because they've split over some issues. Okay, so how do these upstarts do it, right? What do they do? What actually makes them tick? How were they able to outcompete those older forms and actually bring religiously apathetic people into religion? Okay, so what Stark and Fink say is their organizational structures were far more adaptable and created more engagement, right? So they're more fun, right? Now, this is important. I'm going to highlight. They responded to the needs of people. That's an eraser. I failed again. I compound my failures every day. They responded to the needs of people without changing core beliefs, right? And again, we'll see this idea a little bit later, like when we talk about the religious landscape. But one of the things that seems to be particularly detrimental to at least Christian groups, right? We don't have enough data, say, on Muslims in America, although I guess we have enough data on Jews that we can say it's relatively similar. The more accommodated and worldly a religion is, typically the less attractive it gets overall, right? Churches with relatively conservative or orthodox views tend to either maintain their membership or grow, while those with, say, more progressive views tend to pretty quickly go into decline, right? And I'll show you some information on that later. But you could take, my favorite whipping boy, sadly, the United Church of Canada, which I shouldn't be so mean to the United Church, but I can't help it. I guess I have a little Rodney Stark in my soul. If you go back to 1972, they were about a fifth of the Canadian population, about 19%. There's somewhere, around 2.5% to 3% today. And the United Church has become this very progressive, left-leaning kind of religious group, embracing essentially every progressive shibboleth that you could, right? And it does not serve them well. Even in one place, and my favorite kind of United Church thing is in Toronto. They have a United Church minister who is an avowed atheist and doesn't hide it, and has basically rewritten all of the prayers and liturgies to be like, instead of the Our Father, it's like the Our Universe. We thank, and it's like, okay, airy-fairy stuff. But they can't get rid of her for whatever reason, right? Because there's not enough will in the United Church which ostensibly is a Christian church, to kick out an avowed atheist who has, basically created an atheist church all on her own. But they keep paying her. So there you go. All right, so this doesn't generally go well, right? If you can do it without changing your core beliefs, that goes better. All right, so what happens with our Methodists and Baptists? The Methodists and Baptists are really quick to adopt new forms of revivalism and music, right? So the music that they use, right, which again, if you go to a United Methodist church today, the tunes are going to seem very old and drab. But for the 1800s, right, this was the hoppin' new musical style of the day, right? We got away from our pipe organs and towards different kinds of instruments and more upbeat, more kind of culturally relevant music, right? And they adopt, forms of revivalism, right? So a lot of like very emphatic, emotional preaching, right? Typical of kind of revivals was like the tent revival, where these, essentially itinerant preachers would roll into town, set up a tent, and they'd preach these fire and brimstone kind of sermons, and ask people to like come to the altar and give their lives to Jesus, right? Okay, so that stuff was all really popular in the early 19th century, and a lot of it had come over from England, right? Where the great revivals sort of start. All right. Now this one's really important, so I'm going to highlight it. We're going to go highlighter for this one, but in green. Their clergy were typically recruited and trained in local congregations, right? As opposed to those more established sort of forms of religion where basically people went to a seminary, usually at a university on the East Coast, right? Harvard Divinity School, Yale Divinity School, Princeton Theological Seminary. I guess a little bit later you'd have Duke. Is it the Divinity School at Duke? I can't remember. Whatever. Duke sucks. They're very bad people. That's all I have to say, and I won't explain why. If you know, you know. So you had these sort of professional preachers, many of whom demanded things like a full salary, right? A pension, right? A career. And so they were a big drain on the resources of local congregants, right? The people recruited and trained from the local congregations were often, and also, here's the other thing about the seminarians, right? They're academics. Like me. So close to my heart in some ways. However, if you've ever noticed something with academics, this is maybe not universally true, but it's true in certain cases. Talking to normal people for academics is sometimes something of a challenge, right? Because like if honestly, one of my really good friends who I've known since like junior high, he's a plumber, and I just don't bother with academic speak with him because he won't understand the hell I'm talking about, right? I talk to him like a normal person, and that works pretty well. Mostly people are normal people, right? And they don't speak academic-ese. So when you talk to them about, eschatology, right? They don't know what this is a religious term for like what we think is going to happen at the end of the world, right? They don't know what you're talking about. But when you go to a seminary, often you're sort of bathed in that academic speak. What happens when you are recruited and trained from the local people? You are a local people. So you give sermons, say, that are much more topical and understandable to the regular average Joe. Okay, I think I just burned like half of what's on another slide. I'm sorry, just a little lost. For who did what slide? What group of religious people are we talking about? Who did what? Who did what? I don't know who did what slide. Clarify. What group of religious people are we talking about? The Baptists and Methodists? Okay, so I mean, if we're talking about the people that were successful in revivals, right? They were the Baptists and the Methodists, right? They're really successful, and they're outcompeting older forms of Christianity. Please write a follow-up question if that doesn't answer your question. Okay. Wow, time flies when you're talking about Rodney Stark for the last time. All right, so these new church bodies also demand more from their members, right? They are generally pretty demanding. And what does this do? Well, it allows them to root out free riders, right? So as we know, right, because we've talked about this a few times, we talked about it when we talked about strictness theory. We talked about it when we talked about the rise of Christianity. Free riders are a major problem for religious groups. Why? Because they sit around and they consume resources while giving nothing, right? And that means there's less resources for those intensely religious people, and eventually they get tired of supporting all these freeloaders and they move on, right? Now, these newer congregations tend to be more demanding. So what do? They root out free riders, right? Because eventually those people feel unwelcome, or they're all, it's like, you didn't bring anything to the potluck again, Tom. Are you going to bring anything to the potluck next time, right? And they get sick of being nagged about the next potluck, and so they just quit, right? So they generate higher levels of commitment and more resources for the local church, right? Okay, the other things they do, right? They create very distinct religious communities with close social ties. And one of the things that, I think I have them. Do I have the Methodists here? Okay, I won't talk about this yet because, these points, right, go with my next slide, which I will jump to now. All right, so our Methodists, right? What did the Methodists do that was so interesting? Okay, so the Methodists, right? Methodist congregations were basically divided into, or in the early days, it's not like this anymore, but they were divided into small, close-knit groups called classes, right? That were about 12 members each, right? So basically think of it like a small group, I guess in like modern evangelical religious parlance, this is like a small group. But basically you would have been assigned into a class, right? And in that class, you would have, met with that class on a weekly basis, right? And so you would have, probably read and talked about the Bible. You would have talked about what's going on in your lives. And you would have kind of encouraged each other, right? So through this, the zeal of revivals was maintained, right? Because when this guy shows up, right, with his little booth, and he's talking to you all, and you all get really, really excited, that lasts for a couple of weeks after he leaves. After that, the local congregation has to sort of pick it up. And these classes help do that, right? People encouraged each other, kept each other going, kind of, when someone's having like a crisis, of faith, or they don't feel as excited about it anymore, the class sort of keeps you going, right? And these become your tightest social bonds, right? Your deep, your closest social bonds, right? So those really close social bonds means you keep your behavior in alignment with those people. Those people offered testimonials, right, about what the good Lord Jesus is doing in their lives, right? So again, if you remember our rational choice kind of theory, testimonials help establish the value of our religious, why is the term escaping me? Anyway, I'm going to hate myself for this later. Right, we have a rewards, compensators, right? Religious compensators, right? It establishes the value of those religious compensators. Okay, the other two things it does, new people who are converted to the faith, they get stuck in a class, right? And they receive instruction in the new religion they choose, right? So it's not like they just join and then they're cast adrift, right? They're put into a class, and that class helps them along, helps them develop that religion. And of course, right, their behavior is monitored, right? The class keeps an eye on each other. And if someone's slipping up, and giving the neighboring farmer's wife the old funny eyes, you kind of shut that stuff down. So it monitors behavior within the group. Okay, are supernatural and superhuman the same thing? No. I don't want to redo this because we did this at the beginning of the course for like 3 weeks. But supernatural, right, refers to things outside the cosmos, right? This would be the sort of conception in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam of God, right? He doesn't exist in the universe, right? He's not en summum, or the highest being. He's ipsum esse, being itself, right? That probably didn't clear anything up because I put it in Latin, but whereas like, so superhuman is just like anything that's more powerful than a human being, right? So like fairies, goblins, well, maybe not goblins, but fairies, spirits, demons, right? Gods, those types of things. Okay. I assume I answered that question because there was no follow-up. Okay. So, the clergy in our upstart churches, I think I burned some of this already, so I'll go through it quickly. We're doing okay for time, right? How many slides do I have left? Oh, not that many. Okay, but some interesting ones. Okay, the clergy in our upstart churches. They often served for little or no pay, typically holding down other jobs, right? So they might have been the village blacksmith or running the general store or whatever it happened to be. But that meant that they didn't consume a lot of resources from the community, right? So compared to our older mainline churches, right, where you had seminary educated clergy that wanted full-time employment, as a clergyman, right, those people were extremely expensive, right? And it took a community with fair resources to support them, because we're talking Protestants, right? Probably their wife and kids as well, right? But to keep them employed, was expensive. So the Methodists and the Baptists that tended to get Joe the blacksmith to be the pastor as well, right? They operated at lower cost, and so the resources they generated were basically available for current members or for use in recruiting new members, right? For showing how good it could be in those communities. They were chosen generally from the congregation, and therefore there was never a lack of people to pastor churches, right? As opposed to the mainline, where there was a chronic shortage, and this is true today. I was actually just reading Ryan Burge's blog this morning. He's talking about, I think it was the Congregationalists actually, and how, or was it, no, United Church of Christ. Anyway, it doesn't matter. United Church of Christ is running out of, no one wants to go to their seminaries anymore because it's a shrinking denomination. And so they're running out of clergy, which is hastening the decline of their churches, because when you don't have a pastor, you close the church and then people just leave, which hurts your numbers even more, right? And this has long been true of kind of our, seminary educated pastors, right? It's a slow process to educate them. It's expensive. And so there was always a shortage of them. But if you're just picking someone from the congregation, like, you're the most charismatic and you seem to get this whole religion thing, so you're in charge now, you're never short of people. Okay, and yes, this point, I already said this. They tended to preach sermons in everyday language, using imagery and metaphors and stories that applied to everyday life. Sermons by professional clergy were often, and still are, dense, boring, lacked emotional appeal and urgency. Of all the weird distinctions, I have many friends who are Catholic priests. Don't ask. And I will say, to a man, I would say, dude, you're boring. You're just like maybe one of them. I'm like, my friend Anton, but he's in the Netherlands, so it's not especially useful. And they're all in Dutch, so I don't know how good it is. But like to a man, all the other ones I know, I'm like, wow, you are terrible at this. And I'm like, have you read this book, The Churching of America? Let me highlight some passages for you about how you should use everyday language and imagery and not be so dense and boring. They don't listen. But whatever, right? It lacks emotional appeal and urgency, right? Emotional appeal and urgency does drive religious feeling in a lot of cases. Okay, so, and I promise we're almost done. And then you can put Stark away and not have him except in your nightmares anymore. All right, so religious enclaves. So what do we get in American life, right? Well, you have a lot of pluralism, right? Because it's a country that's constantly attracting immigrants, and a deregulation of the American religious landscape. So what does this allow new immigrants to do, right? Well, basically, a lot of immigrant communities come and they establish their own churches. And essentially these are religious institutions, right? that become a space that they can call their own, right? And what often is, and at various different times in American history, like today, I guess, the class upstairs must be leaving because the screen is bouncing. Sometimes the country is not like the kindest to new immigrant communities, and the existing institutions aren't always the friendliest either. But because America has this very decentralized and deregulated religious landscape, they set up their own churches, right, doing things in their own languages, and these are institutions that they control, right? They are their spaces, and so it gives them a place to call their own, right? So these religious enclaves, and you see this, like you'll see this a lot, say, with Catholicism through till about the middle of the 20th century, right? You will have and we still have like a little bit of a legacy of this in Edmonton, because there's just off the top of my head, there is, what is the name of that place? Our Lady Queen of Poland, right? Which is obviously, that was an easy one. That should have been easy. Our Lady Queen of Poland, right? Which I think is just off of White Ave, which is obviously a Polish Catholic church, right? That still does liturgies in Polish, right? We have, just on my way home on 109th, there is St. Basil's Church, right? Which is a Ukrainian Catholic parish, right? Santa Maria Goretti Church, right? Italian. There's a Croatian one too. I just can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, right? You have lots of little kind of ethnic Catholic churches scattered around the city. And if you look in the Protestant space, right, like I think just near my house, there's a Pentecostal church in a strip mall that is basically Nigerian, right? It's just like super Nigerian. And I only know this because one of my friends goes there, and she's like, I think it's too Nigerian for me, though she's Nigerian. So, I don't know what that means, but it's definitely there. Okay, so you have these spaces that they control, right? And where you don't have to be apologetic for your culture, especially if your culture is a little bit different. Okay, religious freedom of the US, right, not only allows new religions to compete for members without fear, it also forces local churches to become more responsive, right? So, facing a crisis where all of your believers are going to other places, right, what you get is older churches start to try and become more competitive. This is especially true in the case of the Catholic Church, which I'll talk about in a sec. Okay, after the Civil War, what you get in the US is millions of new immigrants and freed slaves, right, who create churches that basically cater to their language, politics, social religious needs, their culture, despite limited resources. Okay, so I got the Catholics and the African Americans. I got 12 minutes to do this? I can do this. Okay, I got 3 slides left. I can do this in 12 minutes. I promised you this would be done today, and I will keep that promise. All right, so the Catholics, right? What happens with the Catholics? Well, they use a lot of the same techniques as the Baptists and Methodists used, right? And what ends up happening is they create a really powerful Catholic subculture in America, especially centered in places with large Catholic populations, Boston being one of the most kind of recognizable one. And there are Catholic revival campaigns, right, that are basically called parish missions, right? I guess I could have looked at the slides. And what these parish missions do is they aggressively recruit members into the Catholic Church, but part of this is to take sort of like weak, marginal Catholics and try to essentially, reach out to them and nudge them into the more Catholic kind of category, right? So parish missions look a lot like those classes from Methodism, where basically you would take members of the church that are particularly, shall we say, zealous, and they would go around and visit, other families that live, in the neighborhood, right? Because these would all have been sort of bound within these sort of ghettoized neighborhoods in urban centers of the US. And they aggressively reach out to them, encourage them to come back, right? Try to build social bonds with them, and tell them all the things that the church can do for them, right? And the priests would have been involved, and nuns would have been involved in this as well, right? So very similar, and it has a lot of the same features. Okay, And once they are recruited, the Catholic parish offers a really distinct subculture, right? And that might be appealing to immigrants, especially where immigrants often felt sort of one step out of American culture, right? So there were social groups, right? Dances in church halls, right? And I don't know what other things the Catholic Church did at this period. I don't know. Again, nice picture, by the way, right? It's your Vatican flag and your American flag by the U.S. Capitol. Very nice. Okay, schools, right? Especially in, like, if you look at the northeast of the U.S., right, there's a really, really strong kind of parochial school or parish school kind of presence there to this day. And it's, one of those things where, like, the church is here and the school is attached to it physically, right? So the two things went together really well. And this allowed a lot of immigrants to do things like keep language, keep culture, and keep their Catholicism, especially in an American, kind of waspy American culture that was often quite hostile to Catholicism, right? And literature, right? Specific to religion, but it also generated, kind of native-born, Catholic writers that wrote in the Catholic tradition, people like Flannery O'Connor, right, if we're looking at America. Okay. And yeah, these Catholic subcultures also stressed a distinctive lifestyle and high demands on membership, right? Things like often daily mass attendance, right? Participation in, the life of the community, and, often monitoring if people were not attending mass regularly. Okay. And yeah, lots of ethnically bound churches that helped strengthen these subcultural identities. And yeah, as late as 1916, right, half of Catholic masses in the United States used a language other than English, right? Okay, now, this is also true for Jews and Protestant immigrants who often did very similar things to what the Catholics did, right? Establish German parishes or I'm trying to think of Dutch parishes, right? I'm trying to think of other European cultures, and those are the two that come up that aren't Catholic. Whatever, right? They would have established parishes that ran in their own languages and these sorts of things, right? And Jews obviously set up their own social institutions, right? Synagogues and such. Okay, so African Americans. So after slavery, right? So after 1865 and the end of slavery, obviously we all know it's not like life for African Americans was particularly great, right? The dominant culture was still quite hostile to African Americans. And so basically what African Americans did was largely, they sort of split, they found themselves often not welcome in white churches, right? Even though the majority of them would have been Christian because they'd been Christianized during the period of slavery, right? So what they did, they didn't feel welcome in white parishes, so they went off and created their own church. And it birthed an extremely vibrant African American church culture that survives to this day, right? Though it's a little bit battered like all religious groups are today. Okay, now what did this offer? Well, largely these churches offered spaces basically controlled by African Americans that could be used to meet their needs, right? And among other things, right, it allowed them to advocate for social change using these church bodies as the basis for organizing, right? And because they were in charge of them, right, they couldn't be shut down because there's freedom of religion, they can't be shut down. So if you look at, say, the civil rights movement in the US, largely run out of African American churches, right? And it's not for nothing that Martin Luther King Jr., right, was the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and I believe he was the pastor of Ebenezer Church, right, a black church, again, still around to today, right? So E. Franklin Frazier called the church provided a refuge in a hostile white world, right? Okay. Following the Civil War, Civil War, churches trained new leaders, right? We got our political mobilization. They built schools. They helped found, what are now called historically black colleges or HBCs, right? Developed mutual aid and fraternal associations, right? Created useful social networks, and they became the hub of African American life, all because basically they were able to split off and form their own church bodies. Okay, and what we get is very, very high rates of participation among African Americans, right? So 1890, the Bureau of Census reported 19,448 African American churches in the Baptist and Methodist denominations. And you see how quickly that had grown, right? Because in 1865, there were none. Obviously, because in 1865, that was the end year of the Civil War. And yeah, roughly 60% of all African Americans belonged to these churches, right? So a strong majority, and something, right, that if we look at the overall American population, we don't see those kind of numbers until like the mid 1980s, I believe, if we go back to that chart from the beginning. Okay, let's end this off, and Erica hasn't given me the cut sign yet, but I'm sure she's thinking it. Okay, so U.S. mainline churches, they are continuing to decline. More on that in the next unit. We do have new upstart sects that have appeared, all with rapid and steady growth. Probably the most marked of these is the Pentecostals, right? And again, Pentecostalism finds its beginning, basically on New Year's Day, 1900 on Azusa Street in LA. And by some measures globally, right, there's somewhere between maybe 600 and 700 million Pentecostals. So, going pretty well in a century and a quarter. Mormons, right, basically our first global religion to be birthed, probably since Islam. And then the Jehovah's Witnesses, right, are another group. And yeah, new immigrants still changing the landscape, right? I don't have time to talk about it, but there are new, Nigerian Pentecostal churches, Africanized or African indigenous churches that are being brought over to Canada, the US, by immigrants, right? And all sorts of forms like that. Lots of churches coming in from, say, Latin America as well, introducing new religions and new forms of Christianity into the marketplace. I'm going to go back to question slide for 1 second because I don't have one at the end. Lots of Catholic friends. As if my immediately social circle is built out of a Catholic congregation. Interesting. Yes, you could say that, I suppose. Okay, that is all. I finished 3 minutes early. I am amazing at my job. If I don't say so myself. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move into some very contemporary stuff starting on Tuesday of next week. And you'll only hear the name Rodney Stark in passing, I promise. All right, see you later.